if you follow the news closely, and there is no surprise that today, when we talk about this political complication in America, it's just getting more interesting. As we're speaking today, Kamala Harris officially started her campaign for the 2024 presidential election. Now, if you pay attention closely, according to the campaign video, not only she attacked Donald Trump, the former US president, on the domestic issues, and also attacked Donald Trump on this what we called integrity. But meanwhile, when we talk about the matters within America, it's not just about this social inequality, economic agenda. We need to look beyond those issues. Of course, foreign policy. There's no denying that sitting US President Joe Biden has reached the milestones, again, when we look at the policy in the Middle East, and also this ongoing competition between US and China. But what about Kamala Harris? Again, this is rather crucial, and so far we have not heard anything, or we have very little information about her approaches to some of the foreign policy decisions. What about those decisions, and how should we understand her role, again, for the future candidate of this presidency? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's Dr. Aaron Menes. Dr. Menes is a lecturer and a research associate at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, where he did his PhD dissertation on the national security role of the vice president. Dr. Menes, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Dr. Menes, again, initially when I discovered you, because of this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, How Harris Found Her Foreign Policy Footing, a Good Vice President Has to Be the Ultimate Staffer. Again, as we mentioned before, Dr. Menes, foreign policies are standing at the crossroads today, and particularly we're looking at the policies in the Middle East, and this is a good, or we say this is an ultimate deal breaker for many voters. So from your perspective, again, give us this general description. How should we understand the foreign policy strategies or even the approaches under Kamala Harris, and why do you think that maybe she has more advantages, or even perhaps she has more drawbacks compared with sitting US President Joe Biden? Your thoughts?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, let's begin by saying we probably have never had a president who brought the expertise in foreign policy to the office that Joe Biden did. He'd been in the Senate for 36 years, where he spent most of that time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was then vice president for 8 years. You may not like, there's debate about what his policies were, but overall, he brought more expertise to the topic. And not just him personally, but when you're president, when you're a high-level politician, you have an army of staff. And there's two things about being a staffer. There's knowing the issues. There's also knowing the principle, right? Knowing how to work with the leaders. So Biden had all of that. Harris can't compare to that, but frankly, very, very few people can in the world, frankly. So Harris, in terms of worldview, she hasn't said a lot. She will probably give a major foreign policy address later this. I can't say for certain. She'd probably wait for the Olympics to be done. There's an old joke that Americans don't really pay attention to the election until after the Olympics. That being said, they're clearly paying attention now. She'll probably give a major foreign policy address in the early fall. Broadly, it looks like she's part of the general worldview that Joe Biden has. I don't think you'll see huge breaks in policy. They are internationalists. They want the United States engaged with the world. They're pragmatic. She seems to have an interest in human rights and humanitarian issues. So she may, and by the way, that's also reflected in her domestic policy, that she's always had that interest in theme. At the same time, Right now, her key staffers, the vice president's national security advisor and the deputy national security advisor to the vice president, they're both well-respected, knowledgeable, general members of sort of the Democratic Party foreign policy establishment. She probably, right now, free trade is not an issue in the United States that is popular. And I would be surprised if she broke from that. Just the political costs of pushing for free trade, even though it has geopolitical and economic benefits, the political costs right now in America are high. I would be surprised if she made that a big issue.
Dr. Menace, again, I appreciate that you were able to use the word principle. Of course, that when we talk about the capability of handling foreign policies, and it's beyond that just meet and greet with the politicians and cross the aisles. But let's bring something more tangible on the table. We know that Kamala Harris, again, previously, that before throwing her hat in the ring for this 2024 presidential election, that she actively traveled and extensively to many countries in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines. And I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe she was in Vietnam when President Biden was there too. But anyway, we know that Southeast Asia are rather crucial for America. Again, it's not just about the Chinese influence. It's not just about this territorial dispute. Mainly, it's about this, what we call advanced technological production, or also known as the chip production. So from your perspective, again, according to your expertise, how do you think that Kamala Harris is able to understand the significance of those countries in Southeast Asia? And, we'll look at Vietnam, we'll look at the Philippines and Cambodia, etc. And also able to maintain the good and positive relationships with them, or perhaps that she needs to come out strongly to lay the ground and also make the message clear. Because right now we're looking at the countries such as Vietnam and the Philippines, they're also making decisions on this political spectrum. So in other words, they are also watching this election closely as well. So how do you think that she is preparing her team and also herself to face the reality? Your thoughts?
So full disclosure, I am not a particular expert in the politics of Southeast Asia. A little bit. She has definitely traveled to the region several times. I do know she has built relationships in the Philippines and Japan. Of course, Japan is not Southeast Asia, but it is in the region. Look, Asia, the Pacific Rim is going to be central to the world, to U.S. foreign policy. Everyone in the world is watching this election closely. The difference in fundamental worldview approaches between Harris and Trump, and I'm being analytical here, Trump sees things in a very transactional manner. If I do this for you, what are you going to do for me? Harris will have and the people around her will have a better understanding of the relationship building. Now, unfortunately, for Southeast Asia, for right now, anything in Asia for the United States is going to be seen through the prism of competition with China. Now, for Trump, that's going to be very direct. Again, that will probably be very direct and transactional. Are you an ally or not? Whereas Harris is probably, and especially given her team, will be more interested in the relationship building and understand that that can't be the entirety of the issue. But domestic pressures in the United States will push towards, well, what about China? What about China? I would say, and again, this is where U.S. skepticism, the U.S. attitude towards trade is going to matter. On the one hand, we're trying to build chips ourselves now. We've invested a huge amount of money. On the one hand, our interest in free trade, we're going to want to see countries buying from us as much as selling to us. On the other hand, the de-risking, that is expanding global supply chains so that they're not so dependent. And some of this is anti-China, but honestly, some of it's just pragmatic. We saw that global supply chains have these key choke points that became a real problem when there's any disruption. And Southeast Asia, with its skilled workforce, relatively lower costs, And the willingness of governments to engage and invest could be very attractive. That being, let me just also say, and I know since I'm talking to someone in Southeast Asia is very important, but the world, there is just a lot going on in the world. It is very hard when you have active shooting wars in Europe and the Middle East. They really suck all of the oxygen out of the room. One of the best things to understand is the one resource you cannot expand is the president's time, the president's bandwidth. How much time does the president have for any given issue, whoever they are?
Dr. Manis, I want to go back to the article. Again, read something that you wrote, and of course, we'd like to have your further explanation. This is what you wrote, and I quote, Harris has faced significant barriers to helping Biden since the expansion of the vice presidential role in the late 1970s, and more presidents have been outsiders to Washington, D.C. Now, these presidents tended to select experienced D.C. insider VPs and turn to them for advice and help with Congress, etc. Now, help us with better understanding. And again, you're right that, I say this with humor. I work for media, and I've been following and also paying a closer attention to the reports, and of course, they're on the daily basis. But on one hand, even once that we had a question about this relationship between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to see if those really work compatibly together or even to make a good team. But on the other hand, that some of the answers were still unknown or were still really unanswered at this moment. So again, going back to the article, why do you think that Harris has faced significant barriers to helping Biden? And also, some believe that by receiving the endorsement from Joe Biden, that basically offers a lot more unshakable advantages to Harris for this 2024 presidential election. So let's start with the barrier part, and then please feel free to elaborate.
So I love that question because that is the heart of my PhD dissertation.
Well, I'm excited about your answer.
So basically, in my dissertation, I looked at the question of why did the vice presidency go from nothing? Because for most of American history, the vice president really did not matter very much, to a substantial position where when I wrote the dissertation and Dick Cheney's vice presidency was ending, we talked about maybe the vice president had become too powerful, which for most vice presidents in history, they would just roll their eyes at that concept. So President Jimmy Carter and Vice President Walter Mondale made a decision to change the position. Carter, and this gets to the other concept, Carter was the first modern outsider to the presidency. He'd been governor of Georgia, a very, very smart man. He studied nuclear engineering at the U.S. Naval Academy, but he hadn't spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. In fact, there's a joke in Walter Mondale's autobiography where he says after they won the election, Carter called Mondale and said, "What's it like?" And Mondale said, "What's what like?" He said, and Carter said, "The White House, what's it like?" And Mondale realized Jimmy Carter hadn't been to the White House. Anyway, Mondale said, "It's nice. I think you'll like it." So they revamped the position to ensure that vice presidents could play a role. The vice president has a staff of their own that has substantial policy capability, not just administrative. The vice president gets regular meetings with the president. They established a weekly lunch. Most importantly, Jimmy Carter said, "I need you in the West Wing of the White House." So before that, the vice president was in what was then the old executive office building is now the Eisenhower executive office building. And you have to be a little bit of a DC geek to know this, but it's this giant wedding cake building next to the White House. It's sort of where the back office work of the White House happens. By the way, it used to be the State War and Navy Department. So the US government used to be much smaller. So all three of those departments just shared this one big building. That couldn't happen now. So the vice president was across the street, and coming over to the White House was a big deal. Instead, Mondale was right down the hall. He could go in and see Carter whenever he wanted. Carter could also go see him. But just as importantly, Mondale could go talk to the National Security Advisor, talk to the Chief of Staff, talk to anybody in the White House. His own staff could come in whenever they needed to. And these things have only increased. Right now, the vice president, not just the vice president, but the vice president's staff is integrated into the White House process. They go to all the meetings that, appropriate to their level within the staffing hierarchy. That's the institutional side. I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little long here because this is, 8 years of my research condensed into a few minutes.
Please do, Dr. Maness. Again, so that's why I said, please feel free to elaborate, because again, I really want to get it to the most central question of this piece. Again, this is not a easy way to understand it. As we mentioned before, and also I'm very glad that you wrote in the article, is Harris was actually, again, she faced a lot more obstacles to help Biden. But most of us, from the media perspective, we didn't really quite understand it because, as you mentioned before, we have to trace it all the way back to Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale. So please, we're very, very eager to hear that.
Let me keep going because I love talking about this. It's my favorite. All right, so that's the institutional side. That's how the office of the vice presidency changed. But the other thing that happened was the U.S. government was incredibly complex, but we were electing governors who had very little experience in Washington, D.C. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. And Obama had been a senator, but he'd only really been a senator for 4 years. So he wasn't deeply experienced in Washington, D.C. either. These presidents recognized their limitations, and one of the things they considered when they selected a vice president was picking someone who could help them in office, picking someone who knew how Congress worked, how national security policy worked. And even when that wasn't a top-line consideration, issues came up where the vice president could play a role. So, for example, I don't think Ronald Reagan thought that much about how George Bush Sr., that's George H.W. Bush, would help him. He just needed, he needed a vice president, and Bush was a well-known politician But once in office, they encountered foreign policy issues that Bush, who'd been the head of the CIA, who'd been the UN ambassador, had a better handle on. And he could fill certain roles, be a key advisor, be sort of a utility infielder in a sometimes chaotic White House process. And that's continued. Now, the challenge for Harris is that is not a problem Joe Biden has. As I said before, he knows how foreign policy works. He has a staff that knows these issues. They've all worked together for years. So, and Harris, for her part, she's a very skilled and knowledgeable politician. She's been in political office when she was selected as vice president, she'd held political office, significant political office for 16 years. So it's not like she was a newbie, but she wasn't that experienced in Washington. So she didn't have a deep reservoir of expertise in foreign affairs to provide advice. Joe Biden did not, from what I can see, cut her out of the process. She went to the meetings. You can look at her schedule. There were many days where she receives the president's daily brief. That is the top secret briefs that the CIA provides the president and the vice president, some other top officials, every morning. She and Biden would get it together. Not every day, but plenty of days. They both had to be in Washington. It had to be after COVID when they could meet in person again. So she wasn't cut out. But the question is, what could she really offer in these meetings when Joe Biden and his team already had deep expertise? But I would add, I think she learned a lot. I would say she might have been a DC outsider when she was selected. But at this point, she now has 8 years in DC, 4 as vice president and 4 as senator. She's kind of an insider. I think she's learned.
Now, Dr. Maness, I got 2 more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about one of the most controversial issues in the U.S. today that's centered on the word immigration or even border issues. Now, let's bring this reality into our conversation. Kamala Harris has been heavily criticized about her approach to the border crisis. I mean, again, as what we know from the inside, that a lot of media came out and criticized that Kamala Harris was given the task to handle the border crisis. But meanwhile, that she has not done a well job, or she has not done, effective measures and approaches as people were expected. But meanwhile, this is also a foreign policy issue when we talk about migration, we talk about border crisis. You also mentioned in the article, Dr. Manis, so from your perspective, how do you think that we can understand this foreign policy issue that Harris has been known for immigration and the borders, and how do you think that she's going to stay focused on this issue and use this as one of the, the easy way to say it's winning points, or we'll say the bonus points for her to really be advantageous over Donald Trump? Your thoughts?
So immigration is a very complex and controversial issue. Everybody knows that. I don't know if Harris can convert this issue into a win for her, but I think she can mitigate it. But I would say it is that how she actually handled the issue is or what she actually did on the issue is kind of interesting, and it highlights her strengths and to some extent her weaknesses. So let's just set the table. Early on in the administration, we have an ongoing crisis at our border and with immigration. She had been Attorney General of California, so she had some knowledge of these issues. She made some proposals about things to do, and the president said, "Great, you can be in charge of you can handle those issues." By the way, it's worth noting Biden handled border issues for Obama. So Biden, in his mind, he wasn't asking her to do anything he hadn't done, but the issues become hotter. It's really become a top level, high priority issue in U.S. politics. So, but to be clear, the issue she was tasked with wasn't the security on the border itself. Most people who study this issue analytically recognize the real issue is what are the things that are pushing people to take this very arduous, dangerous journey. Arduous, dangerous, very risky journey to the United States. What can we do to mitigate the root causes? And the real driver at that time was in Central America, the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. What can we do working with those countries to reduce the drivers that are leading people to come here? So that was her task. However, in the media, it became she's the border zone. Now, she tried to play a political game and distance herself from the border issue and focus on the root causes. And that led to, so she took a trip to Central America, delivered a very harsh message to the people of the region saying, "Do not come," which was not a great look politically, because her base is not particularly anti-immigration. But then she gave this disastrous TV interview where, in her effort to distance herself from the border issue, the host asked her, "Well, have you gone to the border?" And she sort of said, you can watch the interview, "Well, I haven't been to Europe. I haven't been to the border. What's your point?" And it didn't come off very well. And you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. However, the other side is, what is the work she's actually done? Well, she has worked with a lot of major corporations to drive public-private partnerships, to invest in the region, to improve the economic situation there. She's worked with the leaders of two of the three countries. I believe we're not happy with the president of El Salvador, so I don't think she's been talking to him. But so now, did she solve the immigration crisis? It's a really hard problem. I'm not sure solutions were enough. And also, a lot of the immigration now is being driven by the economic devastation in Venezuela caused by their corrupt regime. But from a she handled the politics unwisely, but she handled the actual technocratic work. She did a pretty good, she did a good job. She didn't solve the issue, but these issues don't always solve. These issues are, unfortunately, this is the reality. Most issues are managed and mitigated. They're not really solved. So I just think that it's a really interesting case because it just highlights her strengths and her weaknesses. Now, I think she's grown a lot as a political communicator, and we'll get to see a lot of that in the next 100-some days.
I'm sure we will, Dr. Manis. Now, I want to wrap up our conversation by going back to the last portion of your article. Let's bring another person into our conversation, Dr. Manis, which is the current French president, Emmanuel Macron. Again, previously, when I had a conversation with other experts, and they believe that Emmanuel Macron is a unconventional leader. So in other words, the person doesn't play by the rules. Again, this is his personality or that's his political strategy. But in your article that you mentioned that Harris enjoyed a good rapport with French President Emmanuel Macron and successfully persuaded the French to sign the Artem Accords. Again, when we look at the relationship and we'll look at the foreign policy in between U.S. and the European friends and partners, however you want to call it, how should we evaluate or how should we assess this relationship at this moment? It's not just about Emmanuel Macron. Also we're looking at the German Chancellor. We're looking at the new Prime Minister elected in UK, etc. So overall, how do you think that Harris is able to handle those relationships? Some are still new to the games, and some are still, love to be a bench player until the election results gonna come out. So I want to hear your final thoughts.
So Harris has made a lot of visits to Europe. She represented the United States twice at the Munich Security Conference, which is that's a big deal. Biden sent her in his stead, and that's with the hot war in Europe. Now, you mentioned she made a trip to France that was at a fraught time because the French had a contract with Australia to build submarines for Australia. And Australia, in a surprise move, dumped that contract and instead entered into an agreement with the US and the UK to build nuclear submarines. It's called AUKUS. It was a big move for the US position in the Pacific, for Australia, for the region. However, it did not leave the French very happy. So we had some tension in the relationship. Harris she was invited to France. She made the visit, and she really worked to mend fences. She and Macron apparently got along pretty well. Now, in fairness, Macron probably was looking for, he was not happy about the submarine contract, but he didn't want to be on the outs with the United States. So there's probably an element of face saving, but she did solid personal diplomacy. She was out and about in Paris and made a good impression. One thing is, experienced politicians tend to be pretty good at reading and getting along with people. That's that's the job. But she's definitely shown some skill in personal diplomacy. And I think the France trip was one case that highlights that. I think her visits to APAC went very well, and she made a good impression. So she certainly has those skills. She doesn't turn off world leaders when she meets them. There was just a really interesting article in Politico discussing her call log, who she actually been calling and talking to around the world. Most of what she's been doing has been talking to standing U.S. allies and reinforcing the relationship. She's talked to the Prime Minister of Japan a lot. She's talked to European leaders a lot. And that seems appropriate. We've got some, Japan is a key ally in the region. We need a strong relationship. Yep. And of course, Europe, as I said, we have a hot war and we need NATO together. So she's really reinforcing Biden's message by talking to these leaders.
Well, again, Dr. Manis, right now we don't know what will happen in the more than 100 days and until the election results come out. But again, as Harris today officially kicked off her presidential campaign and also compete with Donald Trump, there are a lot more questions to be answered, especially related to foreign policy. But we do believe that you said if she had learned so much, or if she had grown so much under the wing of Joe Biden, we should be able to see another side of Kamala Harris. We should be able to see a more effective and tangible approaches towards the foreign policy. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Aaron Menace. Dr. Menace is a lecturer and a research associate at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, where he did his PhD dissertation on the national security role of the vice president. Well, Dr. Menace, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to the Kamala Harris and also her foreign policy measures. So thank you so much for doing this.